Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today on this December 2nd, 2021. I am Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and we are very excited today for our conversation with Dr. Dorothy Robyn from Boston's University Institute of Sustainable Energy. Before we get that conversation underway, I just want to thank our patron sponsors. Without their continued support, we couldn't do what we do here at the ALN. So thank you very much to these organizations, especially, as well as our organizational members. As you can see, it's a growing list, and that's a good thing. So if you're interested in joining this list of organizational members and sponsors, please reach out to anyone at the ALN. With that, I'll just say next week, we have Matt Cook from the GAO. Same time, Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. So tune in if you're interested in more programming like this. And then last note, if you're out there watching, we would love to hear from you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat or the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar, and we will put those questions to Dr. Dorothy. So without any further ado, Mike Bordenero, take us away.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Dorothy, for joining us. You were a standout presenter at our 2021 conference, and we were excited to be talking with you again so soon. And it was my privilege. I got it to kind of eavesdrop on a call between Dorothy and our Jack Kelly. And boy, the stories that they were sharing about people that they knew and how things really work was very educational. We're not going to go into that level of detail. What we're going to do is kind of just get a general overview of your career, where you've been, and what you're interested in doing now, basically. Why don't you give us a little background of your accomplishments, which are quite extensive?
I guess I'm a policy wonk. I fell in love at first sight with Berkeley's public policy school and really thrived there. And I grew up working in political campaigns, but discovered public policy and particularly the economics part of it, and wrote my dissertation on deregulation of the trucking industry, which came soon after airline deregulation. And so that is a real success story, and it's a real man bites dog story. It's a case of where a group of organizations representing consumers triumphed over the opposition of organized labor and the industry in order to deregulate these sectors, airlines and trucking. And it gave me a strong belief in the power of government reform. And I have retained that optimism. I taught for 4 years at the Kennedy School at Harvard. I've been in Washington ever since. I've been in and out of the federal government. I've spent 8 years on the Clinton White House economic team, the National Economic Council, which was the place to be in the Clinton administration. We were in the catbird seat. And then after 7 years of consulting and a year at Brookings, I went back into the Obama administration, overseeing military bases at the Department of Defense and all the related energy and environmental issues. Just a huge portfolio and just an incredibly rich set of issues. After a little over 3 years there, I moved over to be the public building commissioner at GSA. There had been a scandal at GSA. They brought Dan Tangerlini in as the head of GSA, and he recruited me, and I spent a little over a year and a half there. So, and I have continued to work as doing think tank consulting, kind of think tanky sort of things on issues mostly that I encountered at DOD and GSA related to management of real property and clean energy, and in particular, the federal government's potential for driving innovation in clean energy, particularly at the for facilities, but not just that. So that's what I'm working on. I'm very excited about those. I do a lot of work with the National Academy of Sciences, and that's how I ended up coming to you guys.
Right, you're on the board for infrastructure and constructed environment at the National Academy of Sciences.
Right, vice.
So let's get into this thing you're so passionate about of government driving innovation with their energy approach. So
Okay.
we're all policy wonks, or we're all wonks of one type or another, but we understand that policy is the driver of all of our passions.
Okay, I don't want to not talk about the other thing that you advertised, because I think, frankly, I think that's more of interest to an asset management audience, but I'm happy to start with whatever you want to talk about in there.
Yeah, energy is an asset.
Yeah,
energy is an asset that needs to be managed.
Yes, I just want to hammer home in a more coherent way the message that I conveyed when we spoke a couple of
Okay, well then let's hold off. Let's hold off on the energy passion.
Okay, all right.
And let you go in the way that you kind of formatted your thoughts.
Well, let me, I just want to, and I'll provide a succinct overview, and then follow up in one area that we didn't get to delve into very much. And that is that I've watched a bunch of conversations that you guys have had with various people, and I'm familiar now with Vice's work on and their devotion to ISO 55000. And my message is, I think that's tremendously important. But when it comes to federal facilities, and I know DOD and I know GSA, but that accounts for much of it. You cannot overcome the fact that elephant in the room is the lack of resources, the lack of needed resources. Forget whatever kind of asset management approach you are using, you keep coming back to the lack of adequate resources when it comes to maintaining facility restoration, modernization, whatever vocabulary you want to use. And 165 billion, of deferred maintenance on GAO's high risk list since 2003. The first sentence of a RAND report that I read in preparation for this. It's a terrific report, by the way, called Improving the Allocation of Army Facility Sustainment Funding. And the first sentence is, in recent years, the U.S. Army has been willing to accept risk in facility sustainment in order to maintain warfighting readiness. That is code for saying accept risk is the military's euphemism for underfund. So we have been underfunding facility sustainment, and I would say more broadly, facility sustainment, restoration, modernization, in order to maintain warfighter readiness. This is a structural problem. That is the second point I want. First point, severe underfunding of this activities, huge activity. DoD alone, it's about a $30 to $40 billion a year activity, maintenance of facilities. Second point, the reasons for this are largely structural. And the first one I just alluded to. Facilities do not compete well against ships and planes and operational activities. That is, you particularly see that at DoD, and that is not a recent problem, as Ram said. That's a problem that goes way back. Facilities are not seen as, even though they are absolutely critical to mission, and increasingly so. If you take fixed military bases, historically they were used for training and deployment of weapon systems. Now, increasingly, they are a direct part of the fight. So you have drones flying in theater that are being operated from a base in the United States. You have bases being used increasingly for homeland defense and emergency operations, homeland security sort of operations. But nevertheless, when it comes down to a tight budget, and budgets are always tight, facilities don't fare well against other activities. In the case of GSA, Congress takes money out of the federal building fund, the fund into which federal agencies pay the rent to GSA for the space that they occupy. $11 billion a year. Appropriators have been for the last 10 years taking about $1 billion a year out of that fund and putting it into completely non-GSA activities. So again, it's the same explanation. Facilities don't compete well against more operational exigencies in the federal government. Second problem is a federal budget process that works against proper funding of facilities, because the federal government doesn't have a capital budget. It is a cash budget. And I can talk at length about that. That's a very, very serious problem. And it's a problem that's developed in the last 20 or 30 years. It was not historically a problem. And then the third one is that agencies have too much stuff. They have way more facilities than they need. We need civilian BRAC. We need a military BRAC, base realignment and closure. We need civilian BRAC. The federal, particularly after COVID, the federal government needs to get rid of a lot of the facilities it has that it no longer needs. It can consolidate a lot in a post-COVID world, but that takes capital. What GSA, I think, will want to do is move people out of leased space and into federally owned space, but you need to upgrade the federally owned space in order to do that. So those are the structural reasons for it, and the solutions likewise need to be structural. BRAC, reform of the OMB scoring rules. And I wanted to say a little bit more about one of the structural solutions, because it does tie in with energy innovation, and that is turning assets into services. And I talked earlier about military housing privatization as an example of that. The military wasn't keeping up their family housing. They leased it out for 50 years. There have been issues. There have definitely been some problems in the last couple of years with it. It is still the right answer. We have to fix the problems. It's the right answer. We turned that into a must-pay bill. We took an asset, the housing that existed in the land, we leased it 50 years, private developers, and they upgraded and built new housing. And the soldiers pay for it with their housing allowance. So we made a must-pay bill out of that. By turning that asset into a service, we created a must-pay bill. We should be doing a lot more of that. The OMB scoring rules make that difficult to do. So it would be nice to reform the scoring rules. There's a lot of opportunity for public-private partnerships to upgrade federally owned buildings to accommodate federal employees that are now in lease space, to get them out of the lease space. But those public-private partnerships are not permissible under the OMB scoring rules. That we need to fix that problem, or give GSA the money that it needs to do it without a public-private partnership. On the energy side, increasingly DoD, GSA looking to energy as a service type arrangement. So it's a similar thing. You take an asset, you turn it into a service through a public-private partnership where the private partner fronts the capital cost of upgrading equipment, installing solar panels, and the federal government pays for it in the form of utility savings that go to the private entity or purchases of electric power. There's a range of mechanisms, and the Air Force is trying to be really bold and go much bigger in terms of energy as a service at a couple of bases, one in Oklahoma, one in Massachusetts. A couple of universities have done this where they have leased their entire energy portfolio, all of the equipment, to a private entity. I mean, those are really big, huge 50-year contracts. I don't think the Air Force is looking to do something like that. We will see whether they're encountering some roadblocks to doing that. But that general direction is an important direction for the federal government to go in order to take advantage of private sector efficiency, innovation, and to deal with the inability of federal agencies to do adequate asset management because of lack of access to capital. Okay. All right.
Because of lack of access to capital. And
that's key. Yeah.
And you've educated me. I've had the pleasure of having a couple calls with you, that it's also not the focus of the government. And it is the focus of the private world to be energy, to have these focuses.
No, I wouldn't say that. Here I will distinguish between GSA and DoD. Facilities are not DoD's mission. Yeah, so what you just said is true for the Department of Defense. That is not their mission, and clean energy is not their mission, although I will qualify that when I talk about the importance of energy resilience for military bases. For GSA, that is why they exist. They exist to maintain buildings. And by the way, they do a terrific job under very difficult circumstances, meaning not getting 10% of the rents that agencies are paying them, having that money diverted, rechanneled to other activities. But they take that is their mission, and they do a terrific job. GSA buildings are more energy efficient than their commercial counterparts. I mean, GSA really is a model of good building management, but without the needed capital resources. So it's the access to capital that for GSA is the problem.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Where is the innovation? Where are you excited about promoting innovation, energy innovation in the government?
Okay, so let me just set out sort of the broad outlines of it. First of all, innovation is the long pole in the climate tent. And by innovation, I'm talking about technology that doesn't yet exist. It's not yet in the commercial marketplace. The International Energy Agency tells us that roughly half of the technology that we need in order to meet the carbon goals that were set in Paris and that the United States has signed up to. About half of that technology doesn't yet exist. It is somewhere in the pipeline. Some of it may not even be in the pipeline, but it's in the pipeline. It is still a ways from being commercially available. So that's point number one. That's why I focus on innovation. That's one reason I focus on innovation. Second, buildings are a big deal when you talk about climate, about achieving climate goals. Buildings account, I'm talking in the United States, buildings generally commercial residential account for 80% of all, or 70% of electricity use, I think 80% at during peak demand periods. So get decarbonizing the grid and then electrifying buildings is a really important piece of the puzzle. Buildings are a big piece of the climate puzzle. in order for these innovative technologies, and a lot of that will come down to innovative technologies that improve the efficiency of individual components in buildings, whether it's windows or HVAC systems, electrification of those parts of building energy that are not currently electrified, space and water heating primarily, and then the connection of buildings to the grid, making the buildings interoperative with and interactive with the grid, because buildings have a potential to become part of the grid. Buildings are large batteries. A commercial office building is a large battery. It can store various kinds of energy in different forms, and it can shift load and reduce load and become an important part of a decarbonized grid. A big impediment to commercialization of the technology we need for buildings, to clean energy for buildings, but clean energy more generally, is the lack of information on how the technology performs and the cost of it, including the cost of maintenance. So the cost of maintaining a new component for a clean energy component for a building, that's a make or break kind of an issue. And someone interested in buying a new gizmo they don't have that information. And so a hugely important step in the process, and it tends to be overlooked, is the demonstration and validation of these pre-commercial technologies. And the federal government, with this huge portfolio of buildings, 350,000 buildings, 2+ billion square feet of space distributed nationwide, they are in a position, they are perfectly positioned to become an important test bed for these new technologies, number one, and then second, an early adopter of this technology. So that's my general argument, is that we should be looking closely at that potential role for the federal government. And we have, because of a lot of activities over the last 10 years, the building blocks, or they are there, but they're not very well funded. So that's my basic pitch.
Okay, what kind of policy could be put in place to support more energy innovation in the federal government?
Well, I think it's I think policy is part of it, and again, I think it's more robust funding of some of these building block sort of programs. In terms of policy, and I will give the Biden administration a lot of credit, because I think they are approaching it in a much more sophisticated way. I was on the receiving end of a lot of requirements in the Obama administration for making buildings more energy efficient by X amount each year and X amount of renewable energy. And we did not receive the resources to do that. Clean energy technology costs more upfront. You can think about an electric vehicle. An electric vehicle, the upfront cost is more. You save, it is cheaper to operate. So the total cost of ownership of EVs is quickly approaching that of internal combustion vehicles, but the upfront cost, that first cost that you see, is higher, and so it's called the green premium. That's one name for it. So so federal agencies, they are great at being early adopters, but in the case of clean energy, there is an additional cost. The Biden administration is proposing to give them that money. Now that's in the Build Back Better bill. So we're all waiting to see how quickly that happens and how much of that survives. But that is a big difference from the Obama administration, is that they are putting their money where their mouth is, assuming Build Back Better gets gets through. So that's true for electric vehicles. It's true for electrification of buildings and a number of other things that are in Build Back Better that will give agencies the resources they need to do this.
So that total cost of ownership is a policy issue because so many people are focused on first cost. And the city of Portland, Oregon, in August passed an asset management policy that we think is spectacular. And it includes the concept that when you purchase an asset, the cost of maintaining and operating it for its life cycle needs to be included in your plans.
Yeah.
So that could be a key part of policy improvement.
Yes, I think it's this is a problem with public procurement generally, is that it tends to be very driven by first cost, and it is why public-private partnerships have such an important role to play, because the
Please expound on this. This is a real good point.
If you take a toll road, when the city of Washington D.C. Or the state of Virginia, if they're going to build some new roadway or do a major repair, they segment the design from the construction, from the operation and maintenance. And at each stage, they are trying to get the lowest cost. They are not thinking about the life cycle cost. Someone who thinks about life cycle costs is thinking about, okay, how do I design this? Same is true for buildings. How do I design this building in a way that minimizes life cycle costs? I learned something, or I was reminded of something recently talking to a former colleague at DoD. When the Navy builds a new building, because the Naval Facilities Command, NAVFAC, both builds the building and maintains and operates it and maintains it, they actually do that. So they are in a position to take that into account. That is not true for the Army, because the Army Corps builds the building, but they don't maintain it. It's a different part of the Army that operates and maintains the building. So you need that life cycle perspective.
Yeah.
Most public entities don't have that. Oregon or Portland, as you described, is mandating it. I think it takes more than just a mandate. It takes a real fundamental change in the procurement system, but it's absolutely the right way to go.
And I think we can say that first cost mindset is part of what has gotten us in the problem that we are in. And so this is definitely going to go into overtime. I hope you don't mind sticking around and talking a little longer.
Sure.
So actually, Nick, if you want to come in now, there's a couple questions that we'll say after Nick does the official ending. So if anybody only has a half hour of time dedicated for this, they can continue on.
Yeah, thanks for everyone who's attended. And like Mike said, we're not ending the program here. Just wanted to thank our sponsors. Again, our patron sponsors, as you can see, and our organizational members. We are very grateful for their continued support. And a brief mention of Matthew Cook next Thursday. I found a photo of him, so here it is, assistant director with the USGAO. So next Thursday at 3, we'll have him on, so join us back at this time. And with that, back to you guys.
Okay, so let's go in order of the questions here, just out of respect. There's some pretty long ones. Are you familiar with integrated reporting? And if so, do you think the framework could be utilized to address budget issues involved with the upfront costs of implementing more holistic asset management?
I don't know that term.
Okay.
I don't know that term. I mean, when it comes to budgeting, the fundamental problem, as I say, is it's a very conscious decision by the federal government to have a cash budget to treat capital investment and operating expenses the same way. And there's some good reasons for it. I think on balance, we should have a capital budget, but it's a conscious decision, but it really makes it hard for, it penalizes a number of areas, but facilities is one of them. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about a proposal that the Trump administration made and the Biden administration has renewed for a federal capital revolving fund, which will address that. It's a good solution. It's just nowhere big enough. It's just a very small, it's a band, I called it a Band-Aid.
Okay. And then Charles Silverstein asks, what is the current status to enhance use leasing that the Army Corps of Engineers used for some time a few years ago?
Yeah.
That was structured similar to PPPs.
Yeah. So the Army, the military services all started out using power purchase agreement authority, and it's a particular authority for doing renewable energy projects on military bases, and it just was very, very cumbersome. And the Army hit on this really streamlined approach using a GSA authority, and it started at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, and working with Tucson Electric Power, they got this huge solar energy project done in 6 months, and then they repeated it on 3 bases in Georgia. And when I wrote about this a few years ago, I said this is the what all federal agencies should be doing. There is absolutely no reason that the Army and the other services can't continue to do that. The services each take a slightly different approach to doing renewable energy projects, and we did a lot of great projects in the Obama administration. What the services didn't do, and they need to correct and get right going forward, is structuring those projects so that they're not grid facing. Grid facing means the power all gets exported to the grid. The reason you want renewable energy on military bases is because you want it to contribute to the base's ability to the energy resilience of the base. I didn't talk about microgrids, my favorite topic in the world, but military bases are 100% dependent on the commercial electric grid, and that's vulnerable now. It's vulnerable to weather, it's vulnerable to fires, cyber attacks. So the military bases need backup power, and backup generators are a very inferior approach. So microgrids are a much better approach. Renewable energy, important part of that, but the energy projects need to be built in a way that they're connected to the microgrid.
Will you tell us a little bit more about this microgrid innovation?
Well, so this is a great example of where the federal government can drive innovation, and in this case, DoD, and they have a direct mission interest. So about 10 years ago, companies started developing this advanced microgrid technology. Do you want me to say what a microgrid is, or can I assume people know what that is?
Go ahead. Let's get it on the record.
Okay, it's a local grid that connects critical loads that need to continue to get power, even if the macro grid goes down. So it connects critical loads with on-site energy, and that can be renewable energy. It can be a gas-powered turbine. It can be storage. It can be gas from a landfill. It connects all of those, and the defining feature is, with a microgrid, you can, quote, island, you can isolate from the macro grid if the macro grid goes down, or if for other reasons you want to go off of the macro grid. It's hugely important for DoD so that it can get away from reliance on these crazy diesel powered backup generators, which are not terribly reliable. And so 10 years ago, we started my office, a program that we created in my office began demonstrating the technology for these advanced microgrids. And the idea was to help these commercial firms figure out refine the technology so that they could get it to market. General Electric's microgrid controller went directly from a 3-year demonstration at 29 Palms Marine Corps Base to the commercial market. Many, if not most, of the commercial microgrid companies operating now got funding somewhere along the way from this particular program in DoD, or maybe from another program. DoD is still continuing to do that. I mean, the technology is still continuing to develop, but we're now at the deployment stage. And so it's important for military bases to begin to deploy this so that they can play their early adopter role and help bring down the cost of the technology.
Gotcha. So I've asked Jack Kelly if he would join us to make some comments. Nick, would you make Jack a panelist? And we'll see what he has to say about some of the things that you shared, which was, this has been one of our best our Thursdays at 3. You have come prepared on a level that nobody else has been prepared for this. So, wouldn't you agree, Jack? That was a high level of preparation.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think Dorothy just shows up prepared. That's her style.
Hi, Jack. The man behind City Pairs.
Yeah, there are probably
and many other things.
2 people on the call that know what that is, and that's you and me.
Any federal employee who flies.
So Jack Kelly introduced not only a policy but procedure at OMB that allowed the U.S. government to save what GAO calculated was $1 billion a year in 1983 in travel costs for federal staff employees.
Yeah. And you can change your reservation at the last minute too. So
that's true. Well, I mean, clearly it wasn't just me, it was me and a whole lot of other people.
But the great insight was, and this is the link to what I see the need for in the energy space. The federal government is this huge customer. It has tremendous clout as a customer. And we see that on the military side of DoD all the time. The entire IT sector came out of military investment in R&D and its purchasing, its role as a buyer. I mean, just, I could go on and on about those examples.
Dorothy, your examples about essentially considering, turning assets into services, or turning asset-based activities into services, is a great idea. And I think it's really a shame that there's no one, particularly my old organization, OMB, nobody there is taking the lead to say, hey, this really could be a game changer. Let's roll it out. We've already, as you point out, we've already tested the concept in military housing and in the energy savings initiatives, where they privatize the energy stuff. And those are, it's always astonishing to me why OMB seems to be just like viscerally and automatically resistant to ideas like this, even though these are proven ideas. It's not like we're on the cutting edge of anything here. We're just, in fact, we're reluctant to play catch up, which is kind of silly. But,
yeah. I think that I think the bottom line is that OMB sees this as a means of fiscal discipline, and I'm sympathetic to that. I think they feel, these things that you and I are so fond of, turning assets into services, that they are a form of borrowing, and OMB and Congressional Budget Office recoil at at that. They feel like borrowing needs to be very transparent and incorporated into the formal budget, which it isn't with these mechanisms.
Well, except I think they have their eye on the wrong ball, and it's just which is, I don't know how, I don't think it can be broken. I mean, I don't think that can be fixed within the current way of doing things. And I don't see any great changes coming along to the current way of doing things. I mean, the closest thing I've seen is Art Steigel's idea about that, the federal the fund to essentially give upfront funding to finance capital investments, buildings and so forth, and then pay it back like a mortgage. So it's like the government is its own, lender, which I think is a great idea. I mean, it preserves the unified budget, and yet it provides it needed, not sufficient necessarily, but certainly a shot in the arm for fiscal relief for people that have to come up with a lot of upfront money for facilities. And it's and the other thing, of course, is working capital funds, giving more agencies the authority to establish working capital funds from which their asset and intensive activities can be funded, and use like an internal billing system to raise the funds to refresh those working capital funds. So some agencies have gotten the authority to do really sensible things, but it hasn't been an across the board effort, which is really kind of a shame.
Yeah, and I think there's the federal capital revolving fund, the Art Steigel approach. It's interesting you give him credit. I mean, so this came out of the 1998 Commission on Capital Budgeting, which said no, the federal government shouldn't have a capital budget, but you really need to do something for the facilities people, and they proposed this idea. My understanding is GAO. No. The Bush administration, I think, had drafted a proposal for something like this, and GAO blasted the idea. And so the Bush administration didn't go forward with it. I think David Hahn deserves credit for convincing GAO to propose it in 2014, which they did, and they're very proud of it. So anyway, that's sort of inside baseball, but I think it's so that proposal is only for civilian agencies, and I do think GSA is the one that needs it the most. DoD has a MILCON, a military construction budget that has a certain amount of money in it every year, but I was looking recently at a slide report by the Defense Business Board. And this was a study run by two people, Joe Wright and Danny Werfel, who both came out of OMB. And they proposed an idea like that for DoD. This is a report on real property management at DoD. And they proposed that kind of a capital fund within the DoD fund that internally, which I think makes a lot of sense.
So, as Mike knows, I don't know the genesis of this, but somehow some of us from the ALN were invited to present make a presentation to a college class out in California. And one of the things that I was asked to talk about was what are the differences between the federal government's, asset management authorities and approaches and the private sectors. Yeah. And so I talked about a lot of things, but one of the things, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but it seems to me really not a good thing. And that is the separation of money into, like what DoD does. They've got MILCON and they've got their operating expense budget. Well, the problem with that is that at the end of the day, when you get near the end of a fiscal year and you've kind of spent all the money sensibly that you've been able to spend sensibly and you have something left. Yeah. Well, it would be nice if that money were fungible, and if you had a little too much in the capital side, you could move it to the operating side and vice versa. Back when I was doing strategic sourcing, we had this horror story come in from the Air Force about this one base that this particular person was familiar with. He said, at the end of every single year, there's a scramble to spend, extra money. And so what we do is we basically throw out the old furniture and buy new. And this is furniture that was bought new last year. And so it's only because they're looking for ways to use the money. And if they could have taken that money, which is operating expense money, and spent it on the capital side, that would have been a lot smarter way to do it. But no, that artificial boundary.
Well, and I'll tell you another perversity, although I think now they're addressing it. But if let's say you're a base commander and you figure out a bunch of things to do to reduce your energy usage and lower your utility bill. So you save, $1 million. The next year, guess what? You get a lower appropriation for utilities.
Exactly. So
now I think there is now a program that allows for some of those savings to be kept.
And that's the beauty of a working capital fund. If you have an opportunity, if a working capital fund, if it's done right, gives you the opportunity to actually accrue savings and hold them over from year to year. No, that's right. Yeah, there's a lot of this is the craziness of the annual budget process, or the comptroller. There were some issues where I could conspire with OMB against the DoD comptroller, because OMB was actually very sympathetic to allowing agencies to keep savings and be incentivized by the potential for reducing energy usage. Yeah, I've become more and more, and actually Art Steigel and I had a conversation last week to just talk about some ideas, and I'm becoming really interested in seeing if maybe the ALN could put together a little team, and it'd be great if you might be part of that team, to take a look at the federal budgeting process and kind of come at it new, and come and say, how can we use the federal budget process to make better funding decisions? And so if you think about that in the context of asset management, the way we think about asset management under ISO 55000 is it's all about accomplishing mission and what are the costs to accomplish the mission over the long term. And the Air Force has developed this really wonderful projection, a system that says, okay, here's what we're currently spending on our asset portfolio. And here's, if we do nothing differently in terms of how we spend the money, then this is the way those assets are going to degrade over time. And so they've got a model that allows them to say, okay, now if we change priorities, and so if we don't fix things just when they break down, we fix things if they're important to mission when they break down. But if it's not important to mission, we're not going to fix it right away, because we only have so much money. We're not going to waste it on things that don't really impact mission. And so they kind of tweaked their model and said, okay, let's change funding priorities so that we're going to fund mission critical stuff first and let other funding, come as we're able to fit. So they did that, and they were able to free up a significant amount of money to replace and replenish the things that were mission critical. It didn't get them all the way they needed to be. And this is what really killed me. They said, well, what that forced them to do was go back and look at their inventory and really look for those facilities or those parts of facilities that are really not needed, but are draining costs, because you got to keep them, you got to secure them, you've got to maintain them, you may have to keep the utilities light. And and so it became an impetus for them to actually more actively seek property to be declared excess and get off their books.
Unfortunately, they can't. No one needs a BRAC round more than the Air Force. The Air Force, for peculiar reasons, pretty much sat out the last round of BRAC, base realignment and closure, in 2005. They are desperate for another, but I think it's just seen as a non-starter now. But they just have a lot of excess capacity, and it's very costly to maintain. I mean, pickling buildings where you basically just shut them down, and that's not a great solution.
Right.
So Jack, you indicated that you're looking at new ways of approaching government finances and accounting.
I'm not sure about well, I'd love to make some changes the way the government accounting works, but it's how we use the budget process to make better decisions. Right now, we essentially, because we're not considering life cycle costs, we're not considering total cost of ownership in either our procurement system, which is where you actually execute a budget through the procurement process. But in our plan, and the budget intends to play several roles. I mean, one of the lessons I learned about the federal government, I came from state government. And so at a state government level, the budget is truly a spending plan. It's like, oh, we got this much money, we have these needs, and this is how we're gonna spend the money on a department by department basis over the next year. And it's a plan, and you actually do budget versus actual comparisons in the plan. Well, the first time I raised that to my OMB colleagues when I was relatively new to OMB, they looked at me like I was speaking a language unknown to humans, because the idea that you would compare the president's budget with what happens in reality is just crazy to them, because the president's budget, in fact, is as much a political statement as anything else. In fact, it's probably more of a political statement of what the president considers important than it is what Congress is going to allow an administration to do. And so that disconnect is really important, because it makes the budget process different than what most people think a budget process would be. Certainly different than your personal budget, different than a business budget. That said, I do think that OMB genuinely wants to use the budget process to make better decisions. And when you hear about the capital scoring rules, I kind of hear the people in OMB talking out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they say, well, we want to force this capital lease. We're going to call it a capital lease, even though the private sector doesn't make that distinction in what I would call the real world. But this is a capital lease, and therefore, since you're going to commit the government to 30 years of spending, we need to see the upfront cost, the present value of the upfront cost of that 30 years of spending, which is a big number.
Yes.
And that big number, as Dorothy points out, has to compete with, salaries and operating costs, all that kind of stuff that are like must-have sorts of things in the eyes of most agencies. But the reason for doing that, in at least the way it's explained, is to help people understand that when you make that decision to buy the building or to get that building, you have committed yourself to that. The problem is that you haven't done anything different than if you had said, I want a 30-year lease, I want to pay for it year by year.
Right.
You've done the same thing. And so OMB comes up with what I consider the specious argument about, well, if you go out and lease it from somebody over 30 years, if you have a 30-year lease, they have to borrow the money, and it's going to cost them more to borrow the money than it's going to cost the government. Well, okay, on a building by building basis, that may be true. But what that approach forces you to do is to basically lease more buildings on an annual basis.
Yeah.
It forces you into a more
short-term leases. Yeah.
Right. So, in fact, even though that budgeting approach is supported, by OMB as helping you make better decisions, the fact of the matter is it doesn't. If you look across the whole portfolio, it forces you to make the worst decisions.
Exactly.
So that's why I'm thinking about, maybe it's time to understand that people are trying to do is a good thing. It just hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked as it's been intended, because it's forced bad results. One thing. The other thing is that, and this was something that when I was sitting in on some of the meetings of that BICE committee, that Mike Imony and Jack Dempsey led it, and I don't know where that report is, but I'm hoping that it will see the light of day while we're still alive. It was interesting in listening to the conversations, because one of the things I find unfortunate is that the way that project was defined perpetuates a long-standing problem in the federal government. And as we think of real estate and real property as separate from, personal property. And in fact, if you talk about assets to support mission, in a lot of cases, and Dorothy points out in the military, they know this. I mean, airplanes and ships, that's personal property. That's very big personal property. It's very expensive, but it's personal property. And the only reason we have facilities is because we got to put those airplanes and ships somewhere. And we've got to put the people to operate that equipment somewhere. And it's so facilities don't exist just because it's nice to have a building, unless you're an office environment like PBS. For a DOE lab, for a military facility, for NASA facilities, those facilities house mission critical people and equipment. And so as we think about budgeting to meet mission requirements, we ought to be a little more comprehensive in the way we think about not only facilities, but also why we have the facilities and how all of that together is what really supports mission.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah.
Or-
Well, I was going to say to Jack, I think I have so many scars on my back from fighting over scoring rules. Jack, we haven't talked about all the efforts during the Trump administration where we thought there would be an opportunity with terrific guy DJ Gribbin in charge of infrastructure at the National Economic Council, with a president who supposedly understood the cost of deferred maintenance, and we made no headway at all in the Trump administration. And I can't decide whether I mean, it's definitely, there is a need to revisit that. And a few years ago, two biggies in the budget world, Barry Anderson, and formerly OMB, and Rudy Penner, formerly head of CBO, put a Brookings paper out saying it is time for another budgets concept commission, which is what got this whole thing started.
Right.
So but I think it's a long-term exercise, and there's so much money sloshing around now that it may be hard to get people to focus on it.
My other it's funny you mentioned money sloshing around, because it's a lot of us are applauding the fact that Congress has finally passed this infrastructure bill, which is wonderful. But the thing that I have been frustrated by in the whole infrastructure conversation is, and this goes back to the Trump administration, which, and I'm not talking about the infrastructure week every week,
Yeah.
4 years. I'm talking about, the fact that infrastructure was discussed as something that was important. But it was the discussion was, infrastructure is important. How much money can we raise to support, to fix the infrastructure? And under the Trump administration, the second question was equally important, is how much of it can we get from the private sector? It was a real emphasis on maximizing the private sector contribution as a way of minimizing the government's contribution. And I get that. And I think public-private partnerships are phenomenal for certain asset categories, particularly assets where you have a revenue generating, possibility. But they don't work everywhere. And there have been a lot of lessons learned about, where they work and where they don't work. And oh, by the way, there was a guy, I can't remember the guy's name, Mike might remember. We had somebody speak at one of our annual conferences several years ago who was a real expert in this area. And it was enlightening to hear him just kind of lay out, it works here and it doesn't work there.
Well, the main reason that the United States does so few compared to Canada, Australia, and other countries is the municipal bond market. So state and local borrowing is tax exempt in this country. No other country has that. That's huge. I mean, that is by far the biggest explanation for why you don't see the level of public-private partnerships that you see in other countries. I'm not talking about the federal government. I'm talking about state and local government. It's hard to overcome that sizable advantage. I think I don't know how much there is in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There's certainly less rhetoric around the idea of public-private partnerships in the Biden-led. I think that a lot of that is because organized labor is really of two minds about public-private partnerships. And so I'm hoping that we will see a lot of that, because I think under the right circumstances, it's a very powerful mechanism.
from a personal perspective, and I think I speak for a lot of my ALN colleagues, one of the most frustrating things about the infrastructure conversations that have been going on, and that includes the latest infrastructure bill, is that there's been no attention paid to why don't we make sure the money is spent well.
Yeah.
I.e., why don't we bring asset management requirements into the conversation? And if we did that, not only would it help us have greater confidence that the new money will be spent well, but it's also going to make sure that we spend the existing money well. And we spend a whole lot of money. There's a lot of money in the base for infrastructure. So it's a way to kind of up our game in terms of managing infrastructure and funding infrastructure. And these are not, these aren't mysterious techniques. These are well proven, adopted widely around the world. Adopted actually in this country more than most people know about, and certainly Canada is kind of a poster child for asset management, particularly at the municipal level. I mean, they really have embedded asset management in their way of thinking at the municipal level in particular. So it's just really frustrating that we're having such a hard time getting a wider group of people in Congress to appreciate this. I mean, we've got some folks in transportation. MAP 21 was a really important bill that put in requirements for, grantees for state highway programs and grantees for local transit authorities, demonstrating some competence and awareness of asset management. And so that gave the federal funding agencies a higher degree of confidence that if these guys have asked for a certain amount of money, it's more likely that they're going to be able to spend it well than somebody who hasn't demonstrated that. So
in defense of at least DOD, I did inquire about this and with my old office and whether they were using ISO 55000. And the answer is no, they're using, in 2013, in fact, just shortly after I left the Pentagon, my boss, Frank Kendall, who was then the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, he's now the Secretary of the Air Force, he put out a memo directing all the services and components to begin using the Army Corps developed sustainment management system. This is a system developed by CERL, the Civil Engineering Research Lab, that's part of the Army Corps. Includes builder, roofer, pavement, several others. And this was a big memo with a lot of guidance. And that represented a significant advance in the process. Now, it's not ISO 55000, but it is an approach to that. So, I mean, I think it's not like they're not doing anything. They're doing something.
Asset management has been around since before the pyramids. I mean, it's just, this is the first time that the world has agreed that here are the priority issues in a categorized manner, and the Air Force is using it. And we know that the Marines are looking at it and Army is looking at it. It isn't at a policy level.
Yeah.
So Jack, I've recruited some people for your committee. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to do, but I know it's good. And Peter Cupp from the GSA is interested in talking further. So then once we get something, a document, a panel put together to talk about this, where do we promote it? Where do we get these ideas further exposure?
I think what we have to do is it's like any change management project. You've got to identify all the key stakeholders and bring them into the conversation. So that not only includes, from my perspective, GAO, obviously OMB, and more than just the budget folks in OMB. I would argue that we need to get the management side of OMB part of the conversation too, because you've got different parts of the management side of OMB that they've got their own blinders on. So for example, you've got the people who write the asset management policy, which basically are in the Office of Federal Financial Management. So they have a particular lens, from my perspective, kind of a narrow lens on what asset management is. But what we understand asset management to be in the context of ISO 55000, it's all about managing assets to accomplish results. Well, there's another piece of OMB's management side that deals with performance results. And so the performance people ought to care a lot about how well agencies manage their assets to achieve the results that they project, but they don't. I mean, they don't make
And
that.
people using ISO 55000 talk about its ability to break down barriers.
Well, that's what the management systems approach is all about. It's all about
and
making
so let me
coordinate across silos.
Yeah. So then, Dorothy, how do you think we could get further exposure with this?
I think, I mean, the conversation shifted now, so I'm less, I mean, I'm all for trying to, have another commission on capital budgeting, or revisiting the basic budget concepts along the lines of what Barry Anderson and Rudy Penner were talking about. I can envision a commission, a national commission, like what the Clinton administration had on. Now that's just one piece. I think what Barry and Rudy laid out was broader than just looking at capital, whether there should be a capital budget. I'd be happy if it just to revisit that issue 20 plus years later. That's different than, I mean, that would serve asset management. It would not be specifically about asset management. So
and we're using asset management to be about more than asset management. If we're talking about changing the way the government looks at funding and
right.
So we're just using asset management as the path towards a more holistic, real world approach.
Some administration, I can't remember which one, it might have been while I was still at OMB, there was Dorothy, you might remember this. At some point in time, there was this tagline, budgeting for results. And that's what I'm talking about. It's like, how do we budget for results? And what does that need to mean? And so we close the whole loop. These are the resources that generate the results. These are the results that we'd like to generate. And here's how we're going to be more honest than I think we're currently being about what we actually need to budget to achieve the results. Because we always want to achieve more than we're willing to pay for. I mean, that's just kind of the way politics drives the government to be, at least our government. So that's the challenge. But if just think about the pieces of ISO 55000. So you've got certain strategic objectives. You've got assets that are required to achieve those objectives. You come up with, so you figure out what are the asset management plans. How does this set of assets, which supports these objectives, what do they need to be funded at to achieve those results? And if you don't, and it's really simple, if you crank back the money, you need to crank back your expectations, because you can only go so far with the money that you're willing to spend. And you just need to be honest about that. And then at the end of the day, and this is where OMB so far has refused to acknowledge this, you have to audit the results to make sure that what you're being told is actually accurate, and that the systems that generate those results are systems that you can believe in. They're not just somebody in a room making it up, which has been known to happen.
Yeah.
Well, this sets the record for our longest
I'm not sure.
Thursday afternoon.
Is anyone still watching?
Yes, there are actually more people online now than when it started. And the numbers went up as we went into overtime. I don't understand, but it has been engaging. Thank you so much. Quite the honor to have you for a full hour. And Jack, your contributions really fired the conversation up. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Nick, thanks for making sure all the technical things go right. And Peter Culp will be in touch. And This has just been fantastic. Dorothy, if there's anything we can do to assist you in getting the word out about whatever you want, please let us know.
Okay. Microgrids.
Okay, we'll have something on microgrids.
Yeah, if we were
Put it
doing
in.
if we were filming The Graduate today.
The one word for you,
Microgrids and storage. Yeah. Okay, great. Jack.
All right, thanks again.
Good to see you, Dorothy.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.